Good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Johnston, author of the Brigitte Sharp thrillers and joint vice chair of the Crime Writers Association. And on behalf of the CWA, I'd like to welcome everyone to this very special and popular event. We have almost 100 people here tonight already from all over the world, by the looks of things in the chat, which is fantastic. I'd like to thank Vaseem for asking us to host this event. The CWA has been running many online events over the past couple of years, including our Daggers Awards ceremony twice due to COVID restrictions, and our various series of talks and interviews with real life crime experts, which you do not have to be a CWA member to attend, and the most recent of which also featured Vaseem as a speaker. If you're interested in finding out more about those or about the CWA itself and all our activities, go to thecwa.co.uk. Vaseem Khan is the Dagger-winning, best-selling author of the Inspector Chopra and Malabar House series, and he is one of the most thoughtful people I have the privilege to know, which makes him eminently suited to talk about this timely and important subject. Vas, welcome. I can see you've joined. I can't see you. Please turn your camera on. There you are. And say hello to check your mic's working.
Hello, Anthony, and hello, everybody else.
Excellent. There you go. All right. I am now going to retreat from view. As I say, I will return for the Q&A. But for now, Vas, it's over to you.
Okay, so let me start by thanking everyone for taking the time out from your busy lives to spend this hour or so with me. And of course, thanking the CWA for not just hosting the event, but for being such great supporters of the project that I'm going to be talking about today, which covers these rather tricky and thorny topics. Now, what my plan is to do a slideshow and present you some of the information that's come out of that project. And that will last maybe 20, 25 minutes. And then to leave the rest of the time in the hour for you to ask questions and for us to take some of those questions that hopefully you're going to stick into the Q&A box. Now, as I've already hinted, these are topics which make people uncomfortable at times, but I firmly believe that we have to have these conversations. Otherwise, we're not going to get to the bottom of how we can make things different. I'm going to try and keep this a fairly light session and not get bogged down. I'm going to try and keep it fun, if at all possible, when talking about things of such a serious nature. But anyway, let me now share my screen. Okay, brilliant. All right, let's get cracking. So cultural appropriation in literature, how to avoid the pitfalls. That's the gist of this talk. This is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to quickly introduce myself for those people who don't know me. And then I'm going to cover these various topics, the landscape of diversity in the publishing industry, what we mean by cultural appropriation, and then the specific project that I've spent 9 months this year looking at that particular issue. And then we're going to have a look at some examples of good and bad practice, and then the recommendations that came out of that project. So first thing to know about me is why am I qualified to talk about this? Well, I've been writing for an incredibly long time. I wrote my first novel when I was age 17, and I sent it in to a couple of agents expecting my first contract. There was one small problem. That book was rubbish. And as you might expect at the age of 17, I spent the next 23 years writing another 6 or 7 novels, sending them all in. So I've been rejected by pretty much every agent in the country before I was finally published. So it's a long journey. And for those of you who are in those trenches, I have been there too. This was my first series published by Hachette, by Hodder, set in modern India, where I lived for a decade, featuring a retired policeman from the Mumbai police force. And this is my current series, again published by Hachette, by Hodder, set in 1950s Bombay, featuring India's first female police inspector. And this book, I was lucky enough to win the Crime Writers Association Historical Dagger. And the reason I have 2 daggers there is because the courier managed to break the hilt on the first one, but I've held on to it, as you can see. I have a sentimental attachment to it, even though the hilt is not attached to anything. So that's me in a nutshell. None more needs to be said there. Let's talk about this project. Let's talk about the issues that we're really here to discuss. So, diversity in the publishing industry, in the creative arts in general, is something that has been swirling around for many, many years. There have been numerous attempts over the last couple of decades to do something about making the industry more diverse, and most of them have come to nothing. However, things I feel are really changing now, with more than just lip service being paid to the issues, with some actual actions being taken to make that a reality. But what do we actually mean by this? Whenever I have these kind of conversations, as I did during the course of this project, it amazed me how so few people understood what we mean by diversity in the publishing industry. For most people, all it really meant was, let's get a few more people of color in the door. Okay, let's get a few more authors writing, publish some of their books, and then everybody will stop having a go at us for not being very diverse. It's much more complex than that. First of all, let me be clear. Diversity means much more than people of color entering the publishing industry. It also means other traditionally sidelined or marginalized communities. And that could be gender, it could cover people who are differently abled. It could also cover people who come from working class backgrounds, because they've really never had much of a voice within the publishing industry. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm largely focusing on people of color, and that's because the project was not large enough in scale for me to do, to be able to cover all of those very important dimensions, but it's certainly not because I don't think they're important. These are the 4 areas of diversity that the industry is currently examining, trying to create a more diverse workforce. And that goes all the way from agents to editors, the commissioning editors who buy books, people in marketing and publicity, people in management, etc., throughout the chain. And of course, more authors from diverse backgrounds. It shocked me to realize that even now, in spite of some of the noise around people of color who are being published, the numbers are still incredibly stark. As recently as 2017, a survey by the Arts Council showed that only 4% of something like 9,000 children's books published were by authors of color. That's just 4%. Now, we wouldn't expect a 50-50 split. So, I'm quite a rational person. If the population of the country in terms of ethnic minorities is something like 15 or 17%, then we wouldn't perhaps expect a 50-50 split along those lines. But if it's 4%, but the population is 17-18%, then you can see that there is an imbalance there. And the next thing, the next area of diversity in the industry, and one that this project that I'm going to talk about really focused on, is a diversity of protagonists. So when I was writing for those 23 years, and I wrote 7 novels, one of the things that I realized looking back is that not a single one, or maybe just one of those novels towards the very end, had any non-white protagonists. Even I, as a person from an ethnic background, a voracious reader, had somehow subconsciously taken on the notion that I could only write white characters because nobody would publish any other kind of character. Now, the aim of this project is to give confidence to authors to write characters who are not from their own cultural backgrounds. And that applies to white authors, but also to non-white authors like myself. Because, if I do not allow that permission, if I do not allow white authors to write characters of color, then what right do I have to write white characters? And lastly, the area that is really not very talked about, and that's how do we expand the readership base? We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Another question that cropped up is that very few people considered, why is diversity in the publishing industry important? Everybody knows the knee-jerk reaction is that, well, obviously diversity, good thing, not being very diverse, you're very bad. But articulating those reasons is a little bit more difficult. Now, obviously, there's a moral case. If we believe in a fair and equitable society, then we need to dismantle some of the conscious and unconscious barriers that exist to people getting published. That's simply what a fair society means. And I know that perfection is very hard to achieve, but any steps that we can make in that direction are obviously to the good. The second and really important thing, I think, is that all of us, I guess, are readers or writers. We enjoy books, but we also understand that literature reflects our world and helps us to change that world. Now, when you misrepresent or you don't represent the spectrum of society, then you're really doing a disservice to the reality of the world in which you live. One of the saddest things that I came across was the fact that many children of color have never never felt an affinity towards books because they never see anyone like themselves when they're growing up and trying to get into reading in those stories. And I think that's just really, that's a really sad state of affairs, but we can actively help to change that. Obviously, diversity will allow us to have a wider range of books that we can all enjoy. The last reason I think is the most important and the most telling and the one that has the greatest traction within the industry, and that's the business case. Readers' tastes are changing. Now, that doesn't mean that we're ditching books written by white authors or featuring white protagonists. Absolutely not. Some of my favorite reads are by white authors writing only about white protagonists, or black authors writing only about black protagonists. That's not the point here. The point is that readers as a whole are changing and waking up to the fact that there is an issue within the industry being and the product that they're being served being too narrow. Now, the publishing industry is slowly but surely waking up to that, and the ones who are savvy are trying to get ahead of the curve. So rather than being pushed into it, they're waking up and they're looking for those stories, those voices, so that they can hopefully meet the expectations of these readers. Why has it persisted for so long, this lack of diversity? Well, firstly, the industry makes assumptions about its readers, and there's a famous template that the industry uses. I can't remember so the crime fiction industry, for example, talks about I think 70% or something of that nature books are bought by white middle class women, and I think they coined a name for this mythical woman who represents this great mass of readership. I think they call her Karen or Susan. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Susan. Susan's the person who buys my books, but by making assumptions on behalf of Susan, I think the industry is doing a disservice to not only Susan, who's an intelligent reader and who can decide for herself if she wants to expand the kind of books that she reads, but is also doing a disservice to those other readers who are quietly buying books, but are never really looked at by the industry as a reading force, and who are not Susan. So I think that has really held the industry back to a great extent. The second point that I've made here, comping white. Now, comping white is the title of an article written by a Stanford professor a few years ago. And what it really refers to is the phenomenon of comparing or comping. And what that means is that when books are bought by publishers, what they generally tend to do is look at those books and see which books that have been successful in the past they can be compared to. So what that means, however, and you can understand why. I mean, that's a sort of business reality. If something's been successful, you want to try and get more of the same and sell it, because that's what your readers are buying. But it can lead to a vicious cycle, as I think a little bit of reflection will show you. Because if you're looking at successful books, and all those books traditionally have been written by white authors and featuring white characters, then clearly you're only going to carry on buying books by white authors and white characters. And that problem is exacerbated by the third thing on this list, which is that the industry is incredibly risk averse. Nobody wants to put their neck on the chopping block. Now, that's not to say that editors don't take chances and agents don't take a risk now and again, but it's a business, and somebody has to answer when they buy books that are not following that comping model, and they're taking a risk and they're going out on a limb. And in the past, the industry had been really, really risk averse in trying to do that. Now, thankfully, after 20 odd years, I was published, and I don't think I've sunk anybody's career so far, but there's plenty of time for that to happen. But my point is that I think that just speaking to people across the industry during my project, there really is this appetite now to become less risk averse and to try and take some of those risks. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly of all, often, certainly in the past, where people of color have been bought, where their books have been bought, unfortunately, it's often been a sort of token gesture just to be able to show that, hey, we've got a couple of writers of color on the books. When it comes to actually backing them with a budget for marketing and for exposure, that often hasn't happened. And that, thankfully, is also changing. But again, all of these things are business realities that have to be dealt with within the context of a fairly risk-averse industry. Okay, let's move on to cultural appropriation, because that's a linked topic, and we'll have a look at why. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines cultural appropriation as the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the practices, customs, or aesthetics of one social or ethnic group by members of another, usually the dominant community or society. Now, for the purposes of my project, I'm going to slightly modify this definition, but we'll come to that in a second. This is where my thoughts on this topic started, with Adele. Now, I don't mean that Adele came to my house and we had a good old natter about cultural appropriation. It started because I think more than a year ago, she tweeted this picture of herself. She was, I think, in the Caribbean, and she was celebrating the carnival, and she chose to adopt this African hairstyle. And Twitter exploded with lots of people saying, well, how dare she adopt an African hairstyle? It's cultural appropriation. And a load of other people saying, cool your jets. There's no big deal here. She's in the West Indies. She's celebrating the carnival. It's not that big a deal. So I looked at that and I thought to myself, is this where we've got to? We're screaming blue murder about a hairstyle. Now, I absolutely understand that there is a whole history behind this, and that's not to be taken lightly. However, I decided to write some blog pieces which just suggested that we might have is there a rational approach that we can use to look at these kinds of issues when they do arise, and have maybe a more thinking discussion rather than just two sides screaming at each other. Those blogs went viral. Thousands of people around the world read them. Loads of people wrote to me, and they said to me, we're glad that you articulated what we're feeling, which is that everybody is very quick to stand on a soapbox and scream about cultural appropriation, but there's very little information about what it means and how we can avoid doing it in a way that doesn't upset everyone. Okay, so that's what led to this project, which is what I'm going to talk about now. It's called Turning the Page, a guide to writing cultural diversity in fiction, supported by the Arts Council and also a range of project partners, including the Crime Writers Association, the Society of Authors, and Hachette UK. What did I do for this project? Well, I carried out a survey and more than 1,000 people responded, and that's across the industry: writers, readers, editors, agents, publicists, etc. I carried out a great series of interviews with authors and industry professionals. And then I did what we call a literature review, which is taking a selection of articles that are available in the public domain, analyzing them and synthesizing that information and using it within the context of the project. And the results of that are 5 videos, which are free to view, and they've been rolled out over the past few weeks. And there is a PDF which mirrors the content of the videos, and that I will make available during this session. It's free to download and to use. These are the areas, I don't need to read these out for you, but these are the areas that those videos and that PDF cover. I don't have the time now to talk about all of these things, but we are going to touch a little bit more deeply on a few of those topics. Now, the first thing to remember is that my starting point for this entire discussion and this project is that my firm belief, and the belief of most people, most authors, most people in the industry, is that authors should have the right to write whatever they wish. If they didn't, then that means that we're not really writing fiction. We are engaging in literary censorship, and I don't think anybody, certainly not anybody who loves books, wants that to happen. What I'd like you to do now is to just watch the first 90 seconds of this video.
Possibly the most hotly debated topic in the publishing industry over the past few years has been the issue of cultural appropriation. Although there is universal agreement that diversity as a goal is commendable, when it comes to the ticklish business of who should be allowed to write what kind of story, things get murky. Issues of voice, authenticity, and identity politics are stirred into the pot, and the end result is something that can often lead to controversy. In the first video of this series, I expressed the opinion that authors should have the right to write whatever they choose, including stories involving characters not from their own ethnic backgrounds. My belief is that to bring more diversity into fiction, the industry needs to reassure writers that, if properly approached, they should have no qualms about introducing such characters into their writing. But there are clearly more complex arguments to be made around the issue. Debates about cultural misappropriation and the historical lack of access to the industry for voices from minority backgrounds. Because of these issues, at present, many people believe that there is a climate of fear in the publishing world. Everyone is terrified of making a mistake, afraid of being charged with the crime of literary misappropriation. Clearly, this has an impact on the sorts of books that are acquired, published, and marketed. These are the issues I want to explore in this video.
Basically, what that says, what those 90 seconds tell you is that these issues of cultural appropriation and what we call authenticity of voice are now creating a climate of fear within the industry. And that's where authors and editors are feeling very reluctant to include characters from ethnicities that are not written by the author in question. And the reason for that is because there have been cases of them being called out for perceived offense that's being caused. So now partly this is to do with the fact that historically authors of color have been denied access to the publishing industry. So there is that feeling that if you're going to, for example, if you're a white writer and you're going to write about, say, African Americans subjected to slavery in the Deep South, you've had that platform for a very long time. Why shouldn't the platform now be given to people who are from that community? So authors can often find themselves accused of taking voice away from that culture that they are accused of appropriating, or worse, they're accused of misrepresenting that culture. However, these are two findings that came out of the project. So as I said to you, 1,000 people had filled in the survey. 95% of them agreed that all authors should have the right to write whichever characters of whichever ethnic background they wish. And yet 86% of them also believe that there is this climate of fear around cultural appropriation and voice. So you've got these two things butting heads against each other. Here are examples, fairly recent examples of books that were criticized for cultural appropriation. Now, I want to be very, very clear. I am not criticizing the authors. I don't believe the authors set out to upset anybody, but upset was caused. And by that, I mean that a large volume of criticism was sent their way through mainstream reporting, and of course also on social media. So the book on the left, The Help by Catherine Stockett, was about African-American maids in America in the 1960s. And she was accused of using a white savior lens to depict the lives of these housemaids. It was turned into a film. Viola Davis, I think she was the star of that film, and I think she might even have won an Oscar for it. But later, she said that she regretted doing it because she felt that the book didn't speak to the stories that had been handed down to her by her grandmother and other ladies of that generation. The second book, American Dirt, more recent, again caused controversy because the lady in question, Janine Cummins, was writing about a Mexican mother and child who were moving across the border into America. And she had identified herself as white, and then she suffered criticism from the Latino community in America, who were up in arms, because she got a huge advance and lots of publicity on Oprah Winfrey, et cetera, and they were asking why is somebody from that community not allowed to tell this story or not given the same kind of advance. And again, it wasn't Janine's fault. I mean, she just wrote a book. Things became worse when she then said, I think, that she was 1/12 Puerto Rican. But anyway, the whole thing snowballed, and she received death threats to the point where her tour was cancelled. And again, that should absolutely never happen to any author. In the end, though, both books have done exceedingly well. So, we talk about cancel culture, but cancel culture doesn't always cancel a product if the industry decides to get behind it. But you have to be aware that these are the kind of books that do get criticized. And here are examples from the literary canon, three of my favorite literary novels, where clearly the author and the subject matter are not quite aligned in terms of their ethnicity. And yet these books have done fabulously well. Kazuo Ishiguro wrote The Remains of the Day, the most quintessentially English novel that you can imagine. He was born in Japan, moved to England as a young child, but nobody questioned his right to write The Remains of the Day. I mean, he's a Nobel Prize winner for literature. David Mitchell, he lived in Japan, and so he wrote this book, which is set in feudal Japan. And again, he'd lived there for quite a number of years, and the book was phenomenally successful. No one's ever questioned him on it. Schindler's Ark, which later, of course, became Schindler's List, written by an Australian who's not Jewish, but he worked with the Jewish community. The person who brought the story to him was a Jew who was one of Schindler's Jews, and he went with the man to Poland, and he researched this book, and he told the story. I mean, if you've never read this book, you really should read this book. He told the story in such a way that absolutely nobody would have dared to criticize him for it, because it was told with such empathy. Two examples from the world of crime fiction, very recent examples. So The Last Thing to Burn by Will Dean. So Will is a English writer, white English writer, but the protagonist of this novel is a Vietnamese woman who has been trafficked to the UK. Now, when this book was bought, it was bought by my editor. We share the same editor. Yes, they had some qualms about the fact that Will was not Vietnamese himself. So they did their due diligence. They checked to see what he'd done to make sure that this book was as authentic as he could possibly make it. And in the end, it's been very successful, and Will hasn't suffered any criticism. For those of you who've been paying attention to the BBC, you will know that a 4-part series has just launched called You Don't Know Me. And that is based on the book by Imran Mahmood, a barrister and a crime writer. And Imran is British Asian like myself. But this book is told in the first person narrative, in the voice of a young black teenager, a young black man. Now, if Imran has received no criticism for writing in the voice of a young black male, and the entire book is set in that community. And that's because he spent many, many years as a barrister representing young black men from those communities. So he has a link to that to give him some authenticity. So we're nearing the end now. So the recommendations that come out of this project. Now, of course, they're in much more detail in the video. All of the videos are about 10 minutes or so they're not that long. And in the PDFs, you can read up much more of these recommendations. But firstly, be aware of the space you're taking up. And what we mean by that is to go back to what I was telling you, that, if you are, let's say you're a white writer and you're writing about a minority community, you may do all your research, you may do everything, you may tick all the boxes and do everything correctly. You might still get criticized because of the historical lack of access to the industry for people from those communities. It's just something you need to be aware of. What that does mean is that you need to understand what it is that you don't know about this community that you want to write about. Now, that means looking at your own biases, some of them conscious, some of them unconscious. What, if you want to write about the British Asian community, what are the biases that you have in your mind, in your head, that you need to examine and then try to overcome? Many years ago, I did write a novel set in the Inuit community in the high Arctic. Now, I'm not Inuit and I've never been to the high Arctic. And I wrote this entire novel with the protagonists from that community. And I had to do it the old-fashioned way, which was do lots and lots of research. And in the end, I thought I wrote a really good, a decent book. Now, I never had in the end, I didn't have the courage to submit it, because by then the world had been overtaken by this storm of cultural appropriation and soul searching. And so I decided that it wasn't possibly the most judicious thing for me to send in to my agent. When you do your research, you have to understand that research involves a lot of things, but one person doesn't represent a community. So often, if you're going to write about a particular community, you might go off and talk to somebody from that community. And that's a great first step. But just remember that people are not a block. They're not a mass, a uniform mass. So if you want to write about a Muslim character, Muslims who are born in Bradford will be completely different from Muslims who are born in, say, Sudan. And you know, you can think of endless examples of how people who we tend to block as one category are not a single block. So it's very important that you try to find somebody from that smallish community that you're actually writing about, rather than somebody who happens to span the entire Muslim world, for instance. Avoiding stereotypes. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do, because there are some traits of communities that are part and parcel of being in that community. Now, I'm from the Asian community, and yes, we do have big fat Asian weddings. That's a fact. You can't get around it. But one of the things that really irritates me is when I see BBC dramas or other TV dramas, etc. And we come up with the wife beating, honor killing jihadi terrorist, and those seem to be the only storylines we tell about British Asians. Now, I'm not saying those stories shouldn't be told. They're titillating and they sell tickets. So obviously people are going to write about them, but there are a whole range of other stories that never get told from those communities. So if you're going to write about those types of communities, you do want to be able to say, to try and avoid just sticking to those narrow stereotypes. Using empathy. Empathy is something that's very hard to quantify. It certainly doesn't mean that when you write characters of color, they should all be good guys. They should all be perfect and wonderful. Absolutely not. They can be villainous. They can be rude. They can be, you can use satire. Absolutely nothing wrong with any of that. Empathy is more about making sure that when you do those things, what you're not doing is trying to vilify an entire community with your depiction. Rather, it's the nature of that individual character or set of characters who might be villainous, who you might be satirizing. And if you can do that, then absolutely nothing wrong with showing the negative side to those characters that you've shown, without hopefully annoying an entire community of people. And lastly, cultural consultation, which is just a fancy way of saying sensitivity readers. Now, this is a practice that is now, talking to people across the industry, which is now becoming very, very inbuilt into all the big publishing houses are now doing this, so that if you as a writer choose to write a identity that's not your own, the question that are immediately going to be asked are, what right do you have to write this? What authenticity can you bring to this project? Have you carried out any sort of cultural or community consultation? And if you haven't, then there are paid sensitivity readers, which either you can use or your publisher will send to. In the bigger publishing houses, they will send it to their own sensitivity readers who are paid to have a look at this stuff. Again, sensitivity readers, good thing. Some people think not such a good thing, because it's not exactly a form of literary censorship, but if they're overused, it can become a form of literary censorship. Now, in the ideal scenario, the sensitivity reader will just look through your work and will be familiar enough with that community to be able to point out hideous errors that you've made, so that you can avoid causing offense. That's the perfect scenario. In the worst case scenario, a sensitivity reader is not too familiar with the community, but is being paid, so is going to just give you feedback, which is going to lead you to change a perfectly good book into something that it was never meant to be. Now, hopefully that doesn't happen, but it's something that you should always be aware of when we're talking about sensitivity readers. Bernardine Evaristo, now in 2019, she stated that it's ridiculous to demand that writers do not write beyond their own culture. So as far as I'm concerned, if a Booker Prize winning writer can feel this way, I don't think anyone else should really be telling any other writer, white writer, non-white writer, who they should or they shouldn't write about. Okay, so I'm going to finish now. A couple of quick plugs, if I might be indulged. If you like crime fiction, I co-host this podcast with a writer called Abir Mukherjee, and we feature all of the biggest writers in crime fiction, and we have a lot of fun along the way. So this might be something that you might be interested in. And lastly, my publishers would kill me if I didn't mention that my latest hardback is currently on a Kindle offer in the UK as a Christmas offer for 99 pence, only in the UK, I'm afraid. And that brings me to the end. You can watch the videos and you can download them from my website. I've put the PDF up now, so it's there. You can click on the link. There's a page on my website called Diversity Project, and you can just go to that and you can get a link through to all of the videos and the PDF, and you can download that and read it at your leisure.
Thank you, Vas. That was great. Obviously on a very important and hotly debated topic at the moment. The chat has been lively throughout. Now let's get to some questions. Like I said, there have been quite a few questions in the Q&A box. Start with some of these have names, some don't. So forgive me. This one's from an anonymous. He says, I'm writing my PhD in creative writing, or they say, I should say. Book set in Ghana, where I grew up. Supervisor is encouraging me to only write white characters as I am white, but this feels very biased. I feel it's odd to write a book set in Ghana without Ghanaians. Any guidance, please?
Yeah, well, it just goes back to the things that I've been talking about here. I think your supervisor is wrong, personally. I don't believe authors should be told who they should write about. And I do believe that authors have the right to write into different write characters or about people who are not from their own cultural background. A PhD is a different animal to a book, obviously, or a novel. The target market is completely different. It's your academic environment, and it's your supervisors who have to judge it. So I don't want you to fail your PhD by not doing what your supervisor tells you to do. But my personal opinion is that you make an incredibly valid point. And if you read the PDF and you go through some of the lessons about how to go about doing this in the right way, I really can't understand how you can write about Ghana without. I think you'd get more criticism for writing about Ghana and not featuring any Africans. That just seems, it boggles my mind that somebody could advise you in this way, to be honest.
That does seem like a very odd thing to say. I agree. Actually, along those lines, I'm going to jump down to one of the more recent questions. Don't worry, everybody else who asked a question before this, but I'm going to jump down to Tony White says, great talk, and asks the Turning the Page report. He says, we saw a screen grab of the cover, I think, in your slides. When is it published by the Arts Council? Where can we find it?
So it's on my website now. So you can download it from my website, vaseemkhan.com. Go to the page that says Diversity Project, scroll down, and you can click on the PDF bit there.
Right. Bridget Blankley asks, can you share more details of the Comping White paper, please, so that we can read it? That's not the same thing, is it?
Again, the Comping White paper is mentioned in the PDF, and you can, and then the link is provided in the PDF. So you just click on that link, it will take you to that paper, and you can read that. Paper. That's the easiest way, I think.
All right. Lorna Patterson asks, how can self-publishing help with the issue of Comping White and other outcomes of a lack of diversity?
All right. So self-publishing is a whole different kettle of fish, in the sense that it's largely unregulated, so anyone can publish anything. But the negative side of it is, of course, that you don't have the support of the industry, the traditional side of the industry. So you've got to do your own marketing, your own publicity, etc., etc. You don't get invited to festivals, etc., etc. My personal advice would be that if you're going down the self-publishing route, is to still follow all of the guidance, do your homework, make sure that you don't write something that is going to upset somebody. Now, it may not lead to a big storm on social media because it's a self-published book and it's not in the mainstream eye. But you yourself would not hopefully want to write a book that's going to offend anyone. And at the same time, if you're being rigorous, then ideally you should pay for either a sensitivity reader, or if you have some friends, just take some friends from that community out for lunch, get them to read the book. Bear in mind, though, that friends are not professional readers, whereas paid sensitivity readers and a paid editor will hopefully prevent you from making mistakes that it may not cost you, as I said, a public storm because your book is not really in the public eye because it's self-published, but it might cost you readers, it might cost you negative comments when you're trying to get Amazon reviews, for instance.
All right. One topic that got a lot of people asking questions, a lot of questions all along the same lines. I think this was first raised by Jessica Twos in the chat. The writers that you gave as examples who've suffered controversy were all women. And of course, Adele is a woman. And then the writers that you gave as examples who've got away with it, Ishiguro, Mitchell, Keneally, all men. Is this symptomatic? Is this a coincidence, or is this something that you've seen while you've been researching?
Complete coincidence. To be honest, until you mentioned it there, or people had mentioned it in the chat, I hadn't even realized that that's what I'd done, that those were the ones that I am most familiar with, those two cases, Catherine Stockett and Janine Cummings. And the other three books just happened to be, literary books that they're three of my favorite books. But no other reason. No, I don't think there's any particular reason why women or men should be the guilty parties or not, as the case may be. Absolutely not. Anyone can make these mistakes.
I think the question was more that not that anybody can make the mistakes, but are women perhaps, punished more for making those mistakes?
Oh, that's an interesting question. That's not something that came up in the research in particular. Nobody mentioned that perhaps women were targeted more when they made such a mistake. I don't know. Traditionally, of course, because it was always men who ruled the publishing industry and were published more than women, going back for the last 100 years or whatever, they were always the one who were doing the appropriating. And they got away with it because nobody was talking about it. Now things have flipped around. So, for example, certainly in the crime fiction industry, as you know, many of the big authors now are women. So certainly say psychological noir, which is possibly the biggest growth area in crime fiction, maybe in any genre in the world, that is dominated by women. And that might be one reason why women are in the public eye a lot more, so that when these mistakes happen, the chances are, the odds, the percentages are, it's going to be a woman who gets in the public eye for this kind of thing.
Jessica's follow-up question is, realistically, should female authors use male pen names if they're planning to do this? No, I think that's a question only your agent can answer for you, Jessica.
No, I don't believe that. I personally don't believe that anyone should use a pen name unless they really, really want to, or they have a logical business reason for doing so. You certainly shouldn't do it because you feel afraid that you might get called out for something. That would be the wrong reason to use a pen name.
All right. Another anonymous question. In my mind, this person writes, my main character happens to be a person of color. There's no narrative need for this. It's just how I imagine her. So far, I have been extremely hesitant to write her as such because I worry about being called out for writing outside my culture. I'm a white woman. What should I do?
Well, I think the first thing is you use the word imagination. When I was young, I was a huge fan of Terry Pratchett and his Discworld series. And there's a wonderful quote in one of his books where he says that ideas are always sleeting through the universe, waiting for someone's head to pop into. And that's how I think of fiction. Ideas just pop into our heads as writers. And when they do, and it's an idea that excites you, I think you should run with it. I don't think you should start second guessing yourself. If you have imagined a character who is of a particular type, of a background, go with your instincts. But do the research, do the work. Try to make sure that when you write that character, you don't write it in a way that's just going to cause offense. And I think, with those examples that I gave you, very recent ones of Will Dean and Imran Mahmood, it's obvious that the industry is backing. You don't get a BBC show made where you're an Asian writer writing a black teenage character if everybody was just going to tear everybody down all the time. So clearly there are ways to do it that are correct.
I'm going to collate a few more questions into one. There's a few people, Fiona Veach-Smith and Kingsley Pearson and Catherine Clements have all asked sort of around the same subject, which is, have you seen in the industry, it's all very well saying authors should feel they have the right to write anything, but what about publishers and agents? Have you seen any reluctance on the part of agents to take books that might be writing outside of a culture to publishers, or on the part of publishers to then publish those books? And is there anything that publishers or the industry can do about it? Fiona, for example, says, is there scope for somebody like the Publishers Association to agree to even like a code of practice or something?
I am skeptical about mandatory codes of regulations or codes of practice. And the reason for that is that to try to get agreement over what exactly constitutes cultural appropriation, what is right and what is wrong. I mean, it's a quagmire that most people would avoid wanting to step into, and certainly not want to commit to paper what exactly, because who's drawing the lines? Who's going to decide what's right or what's wrong? And as we've seen today, we are, there are blind spots, right? I mean, my project, as some of the people have commented on, did I interview enough women? Did I take into account different subsets? I don't know is the answer. I mean, I interviewed a lot of people that I knew across the industry, and in my opinion, yes, there were lots of women in that. There were lots of people of color, or as many as I could find within the industry, which is not that many. So I tried to get as many voices that I could feasibly do within the time frame. And now when you think of trying to put all of those people together and getting them to write a code of practice, I'm skeptical. So maybe that will change over the years as the ideas of that I'm talking about are sort of more set in stone. But until then, I don't think there are statements. There are statements out there where people are looking to avoid this kind of thing, and so they put out statements. But I don't think they're an actual code of practice. This is one of the first projects that I know about. I did big trawl to find out any other advice, and I couldn't really find any real synthesized advice in this form, which is one of the reasons for doing it.
Here's an interesting one, and this is something that I know has come up in other conversations about this sort of thing before. Nina Badrashwar and V. Walker both ask about writing in patois and cultural dialects, and if you're writing a historical novel, even sort of pidgin English or something, is this now looked down upon? Is it ever appropriate? Was it ever appropriate?
Okay, this is something I do touch on in the PDF. It is a minefield. I'll be honest with you, it's a minefield. If you're, for instance, a white writer and you're going to write patois because your characters are set in the West Indies, yes, it makes sense. Logically, it makes sense. But at this moment in time, I do feel it will be even harder for you to get that book through the various gatekeepers, such as agents, etc., because they are a bit scared. They are scared of a white writer writing in that particular native dialect. The best solution to such a thing is to perhaps water down the dialect so that it doesn't come across as you. I don't know what the truth is, I don't know the right answer for that, but I do know that is a definite concern. That is a definite concern.
It is, yeah. We've got time for just a couple more. Julie Anderson asks, she says, interviewing a woman writer of color recently, the issue of cultural appropriation arose, and she felt strongly about the taking of space which could be occupied by writers of color, which you mentioned during your talk. But she acknowledged that two things had to be considered, not just the book, but also the world into which the book is released, which kind of ties into what you were just saying there, I think. Julie says, I found this analysis useful. What's your view?
Well, think of it this way. When a very famous white writer, very popular, sells millions and millions of books, chooses to write a character of color into their books, there are two ways you can think about it. You can either be very negative and say, well, look at this white writer who's already a millionaire getting paid loads of money and now busy appropriating my culture or some culture that's not theirs just to make more money. That's one way of thinking about it. Whereas, and you can say that the industry is not giving the same chance to a person of that color. The other way of looking at it is to say that by that very popular writer putting those characters in and making them mainstream, as long as they're not given, they're sidelined or caricatured or turned into stereotypes, which we all hate to see if it's our black community, if we see them stereotyped by a person of a different community. But if they can use that to platform those characters of color, those protagonists, and millions and millions of people around the world are now reading a well-rounded, well-drawn protagonist from that culture and learning something about that culture because of this popular white writer, for me, that's a positive. So there are negatives and positives to all of those kind of things. So it's absolutely right. That's the world we live in. That's the industry we live in. It will be another decade or 2 decades before we have lots of writers of color on an equal footing, selling millions and millions of books around the world, and then that equation will change. But at the moment, so let's say J.K. Rowling, for instance, decides to write a character. I don't know why I said J.K. Rowling, because I couldn't think of a more controversial name, could I? But but let's Richard Osman. There's an example for you. Richard Osman, I think his first book featured a Muslim character, which was, I think, really reasonably well drawn. And that book has sold loads and loads, and people have learned something about that character. So
I think that book's just been declared something like the 3rd best-selling paperback of all time in Britain or something. It's ridiculous.
Well, there you go. So lots of people have learned about. I think the character's name was Ibrahim, I believe.
All right. Final question. Peter Bromley asks, in one of the videos, you suggest that the inclusion of characters of diverse backgrounds should be in large part driven by the literary need or plot. He says, I have just written a novel that I feel falls into this scenario. Can you elaborate more on this aspect, please?
Well, yeah, that absolutely goes back to what I said at the very beginning, is that all authors have the right to write whatever they want. And we're talking about fiction. We're not talking about writing autobiographies. If we're all going to write only about characters who are similar to us, whether it's color or another aspect of our identity, we're just going to be writing, thinly veiled autobiographies. Really good fiction is led by the characters and the plot. It's not led by politics. It's not led by the author trying to second guess, how the market will react to the political issues around that book. It's got to come from your heart, from your mind, what is powering your imagination. Because if you don't have that, then writing is a very soulless endeavor for you, and you're never really going to enjoy it. Even if you have some success, you're not going to enjoy the process. So absolutely, to whoever asked that question, I would say your characters, whatever color they are, whatever background they are, they're powering your plot. Allow their voices to sing, and just follow them on their journey. And hopefully, if you follow some of the advice from this session or the PDF, you'll do justice to them without causing offense.
What a great note to end on. One more question. A couple of people have asked, who's the artist of the painting behind you?
IKEA. Mr. IKEA.
Perfect. All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all we've got time for. I mean, this is a subject that people will continue to discuss and debate for a long time to come, as you say, 10, 20 years before.
Yes. And can I just say to people that this material is now freely available. So please distribute to anybody you feel could benefit from it. I mean, I did this because I was passionate about the topic. And I just wanted to get into the hands of as many people who can use it. So send it to forums, send it to friends, send it to whoever you think can use it. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, thank you. You've given us all a lot to think about, and thank you for doing the research and putting the work in.
Thank you for hosting, and thank you for being a tech wizard as well. I couldn't have done it without you.
Well, on behalf of the CWA, thank you to everyone who tuned into this event. Everybody who asked a question, remember that we are at thecwa.co.uk. And Vas, on behalf of everyone here tonight, let me say thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Enjoy
Take
your
care,
dinners.
everybody, and good night.